Go.
Hi, Ross.
Hey, Matt.
How's it going?
Good. We're going to do a special express edition of Blogging Heads because I've had so many technological problems in the last half hour that I've cost us about half of our time.
Right.
So I apologize for that, but I know that the Blogging Heads empire needs content, and we have to give the people what they want, even if it's only in half-hour doses.
Exactly. So I guess first off, I wanted to talk about Fred Thompson, who there was this sort of curious, explosion of interest in his campaign, notwithstanding the fact that he isn't even an announced candidate. He polls surprisingly well for a former senator who I think isn't all that well known and who hasn't been running for president. But he seems to sort of be the I don't quite know what you want to call it, the generic Republican that a certain element of the primary voters crave.
That seems to be true, and I have to say I've gone through a sort of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages in my reaction to Fred Thompson, starting with amusement at the idea, followed by disbelief that so many people were taking it seriously, and now I've moved on to acceptance, and I think that he has actually quite a good chance of being the GOP nominee.
Yes, no, I mean, I found myself writing the other day, half in jest, that my prediction is that he will be the GOP nominee. Because, I mean, I don't know, I think we both noted before, but, there's sort of the three leaders in the field right now are all a little bit, heterodox, not exactly, huge base pleasers, and yet at the same time don't seem to be heterodox in, really helpful ways. I mean, it's hard to say that, I guess some people say this, but, I don't think that Republicans have been, lost the midterms because they didn't have enough cross-dressers running for Congress.
I didn't notice that as a particularly big factor in '06. And also, a figure like, John McCain is heterodox on an issue like campaign finance reform, which isn't going to be a big issue, I think it's safe to say, in 2008.
Right, nobody cares.
Right, and what you usually have in a successful presidential campaign is a candidate needs to find a group of issues and pander to the base on them in the primaries, and he needs issues that matter to the base but not to swing voters. And then he can go and find some issues that matter to swing voters and move to the center on them in the general election.
Right.
And the problem is that all the Republican candidates, they feel the need to pander to the base in the primaries on issues like the flat tax.
Well, the flat tax and of course, Islamofascism.
Right, the war against Islamofascism, yeah. Whereas, what the party actually needs, obviously this is my own personal theory and I'm writing a book about it, so I'm probably a little bit too invested in it, but what the party actually needs, I think, is, somebody who can deviate from conservative orthodoxy on, issues like the state of the working class in America, and instead you have a bunch of people who deviate from the party's orthodoxies on issues like immigration, gun control, and campaign finance reform, which aren't issues that Republicans have been losing elections on recently, as far as I can tell.
Right. So we agree about that, and perhaps it's better to move on to other things. But you were blogging on these kind of points, and suggested, I think, along with David Brooks, that the Republicans need some kind of new ideas about the problems facing the middle class economic anxieties, I guess is the way to put it.
I think that's a good proxy for what we were
right.
What Brooks in particular was talking about.
And this created a kind of storm of indignation from Jonah Goldberg, in which he, his first impulse, I believe, was to, as he seems to like to do, imply that you are an anti-Semite.
Well, actually, first there was a storm of indignation from my colleague at The Atlantic, Andrew Sullivan, who wrote a long fisking of Brooks's column, essentially, arguing that no, actually the party needs to get back to its small government
get back to its small government.
so forth.
This actually brings up a sidebar I've sort of been meaning to raise, which is that I hear now and again from conservative pundits and like backbench Republican members of the House the theory that the Republicans lost the midterms because of too much pork barrel spending. And I kind of wonder if anyone actually believes that, or if that's just sort of like one of those things that people pretend to believe.
No, I think a lot of people actually believe it.
Okay.
I think the way the argument goes is they'll say, look, the reason people accepted voting for the Democrats is if both parties are the party of big government, why not vote for the one that knows how to do it? This was a common response to Brooks's column, because Brooks had said, well, if voters really want to return to small government purism, they have a pretty funny way of showing it, since they're voting for Carl Levin and so on. I think was the example he used. And the response to that is basically just that voters do care about pork busting. They do care about small government, but it just shows up. It only shows up when Republicans offer that.
Well,
as an alternative.
this is like the classic argument of the extremist with the unpopular views, right? That we need a choice, not an echo. Given the choice between a Republican and a Republican, people pick the Republican every time, I think was Ralph Nader's slogan. And so. At any rate, I mean, the point is, Andrew Sullivan sort of stood up for this kind of point of view, that kind of get back to our small government roots, except his vision of the Republican Party's roots is one in which it embraces gay marriage.
Well, and the thing, my argument with Andrew is that I don't think there's actually that much substantive difference between him and Brooks, because Andrew's a smart guy. He recognizes that the GOP isn't going to run a campaign on abolishing the Department of Education or something. And what he wants, basically, it seems to me, is a combination of good government center-rightism, going after corporate welfare and farm subsidies and so on, with a carbon tax and some form of universal private health insurance, which I think that's actually a perfectly reasonable constellation of views. I don't think it represents a return to small government purity in any way, shape, or form. I think it's actually pretty close to what Brooks believes in.
Right.
I think that Andrew, and I've been blogging about this, I think because he both dislikes the Bush administration's pork barrel spending and he dislikes its social conservatism, he's basically convinced himself that these two go hand in hand, and he's created what he calls the Christianist-dominated welfare state as his enemy. And I actually think these two things are not really connected at all. I mean, I think that's true, and they're probably separable. But let's get back to Jonah Goldberg. So Jonah jumped in and said, well, in this debate, I'm inclined to side with Andrew because he doesn't think the GOP needs new ideas, or he doesn't think it. He leans on the stick in the mud side, as he would put it, and that new ideas for new ideas' sake is a bad idea, and there's nothing wrong with conservatives going honorably into the political wilderness based on their old ideas.
Right. I mean, I guess I actually, in some ways, I wrote a blog post that was heavily disparaging of this, but I thought back about it, and I guess I have a certain sympathy to what he literally said. I mean, I enjoyed, this was when people were saying Democrats needed new ideas, John Shade's sort of case that the old ideas were fine. I guess the issue, though, is that the claim Brooks is making isn't really that the Republican Party's old ideas are inadequate to the times, but that there actually aren't any ideas on these subjects, which I think is slightly different. Right? I mean, he's not saying that the old conservative solution to middle-class anxiety about globalization, should be abandoned in favor of a new one, but rather that because there's globalization and then there's globalization-related anxiety, one needs to have ideas about this, as opposed to just an absence of ideas, which seems to me to, in fact, be what Jonah is embracing here.
Well, I mean, I think that the counter-argument there would be that the old conservative idea is that you just have to accept a certain amount of creative destruction, and over time, all middle-class anxieties and working-class anxieties will even out, and that the last thing you want to do is for the government to intervene in the economy to a greater degree. I think that would be the old conservative idea that Jonah's defending.
I mean, maybe, but I mean, especially in the context of this, somewhat, I thought, fussy kind of, notion of being the proud stick in the mud, right? I mean, opening the American economy to sort of unprecedented new kinds of foreign competition and, technological dynamism and so on and so forth is not, small c conservative moves in that kind of sense, right? I mean, these are ideas of their own. This, some kind of deal with South Korea is going down, so on and so forth. And, I mean, I really do think that, just logically, I mean, one can be sort of against change, or else one can be for change and want to somehow, deal with its consequences. But that, I mean, it really struck me that I think Jonah was expressing just a kind of laziness, and like he didn't want to be bothered to think about this.
Well, Jonah has this line that he likes to use, I think, about how if you look at, if you think of problems as boulders coming down the road, 5 out of 6 of them will bounce out of your way before they hit. And and I think that that's a good generalized conservative insight, that you don't want to, over-obsess about problems that are 20 years down the line and so forth, and might attempt to micromanage the future in some way. I think in this case, he's just sort of, I mean, maybe it's in curiosity, maybe it's just, everybody has a set of issues they're interested in, and he's not interested in issues of, the state of the working class and the American economy. But, in this case, I don't think it's a boulder that's 20 years down the road and we can hope it bounces away. I think it's sort of a nest of problems that's with us at the moment, and that you could see them playing out in the last election.
Right. No, I mean, on the one, I read a column by someone, a town hall column, or a town hall guy writing in the Politico today, and he was saying that, conservatives should really take a closer look at Newt Gingrich, because...
That's right, yeah, I read that too.
Because Newt... might turn out... I mean, Newt would lose catastrophically. I've been just musing last night about writing something about how Newt Gingrich could provoke a Goldwater-esque defeat. And this guy's argument was actually that, Newt could be the new Goldwater. And it seems to me that, before people get so blithe about that kind of thing, which liberals were inclined to, some, after losing in 2004, and remember, I mean, a lot of things happened between 1964 and 1980.
Yes, including the collapse from within of American liberalism.
Right, but I mean, American liberalism. I mean, the point is, I think there's this story the conservative movement likes to tell itself about Goldwater being vindicated by Reagan, because after Reagan won in 1980, self-identified movement conservatives came to occupy positions of power in the United States. But the fact remains that the policy status quo, after Reagan left office, was well to the left of where it had been when Goldwater ran. Right? I mean, Ronald Reagan partially rolled back an expansion of the welfare state that happened because Lyndon Johnson secured such an overwhelming majority.
Yes. No, I think that's pretty obviously true.
Right. So, I'm as I say, I think people sort of tend to overreact to the winds of electoral fortune, and, when the Democrats had sort of, lost 2 elections in a row after 2004, you got kind of like, I don't know, a lot of weird notions out there, including some people saying, maybe it's time for a Barry Goldwater moment where we just, tank the election and so forth. And, it's never, I think, a good idea to tank the election.
Well, no, and this was, in both 2004 and 2006, as a conservative who was disgruntled with George W. Bush, I sort of went back and forth on, well, do I want Bush to win in 2004? And then, do I want the Republicans to win in 2006?
Right.
And in each case, I never sort of, finally came down on either side of the issue. And, when the GOP lost the House and Senate in 2006, I was partially unhappy and partially gratified and so forth. But it was precisely that argument that often brought me back to thinking, well, no, I don't want John Kerry to be president, and no, I don't want the Democrats to take power, because, yeah, you don't just trade away elections, and you certainly don't trade away multiple elections for the sake of, returning to power in 2016 or 2020.
Right. I mean, there can be certain upsides to defeat, or at least, you try to. To take advantage of certain favorable aspects of it. But I mean, all else being equal, it's pretty much always better to win.
Yeah, I mean, you make this point that look, we have a two-party system. The Republicans are going to be in power sometimes. The Democrats are going to be in power sometimes. And yes, clearly you can't get too upset about losing an election. But it doesn't mean that you start to deliberately set out to lose an election.
Right. I mean, this is what, to me, has been so curious about the sort of persistence of some conservatives saying that Newt Gingrich maybe should be the presidential nominee, because it's like they've forgotten. I mean, Newt Gingrich was incredibly unpopular. He was, it seems, a highly effective sort of organizer as a minority leader and so on and so forth. But I mean, when he was in the national spotlight as the face of the Republican Party, it was an unmitigated fiasco for them. And the entire Clinton re-election campaign in 1996 was to try and indicate that Bob Dole resembled Newt Gingrich, which I think would be an easy case to make about Newt Gingrich.
Well, I do think that, I mean, bringing us back to the original point, I think that actually the entrance of Fred Thompson into the race, assuming it happens and assuming that he continues to attract support from Republicans, is going to kill, or at least severely wound, the already unlikely idea of Newt Gingrich getting a nomination. I mean, I think part of the thing that inspires conservatives to dream of Newt is just their dissatisfaction with the mainstream field, and it's the same thing that inspired Democrats to dream of, going down to a glorious Democrat wing of the Democratic Party defeat with Howard Dean in 2004. If you're dissatisfied with your ideologically compromised main candidates, then yeah, sure, you pine for a Newt Gingrich.
Sure.
But if someone like Fred Thompson comes in who's less ideologically compromised, then Newt Gingrich starts looking a lot less appealing.
Right. Well, and Fred Thompson, he's good on TV. He somehow managed to get elected district attorney in Manhattan.
Yeah. Well, right. No, I was just talking to somebody about that today, and they were saying, yeah, no one with that accent could ever get elected district attorney in Manhattan. But, well, I mean, my concern with the Republicans, and it comes up a little bit when Jonah talks about, the conservative movement going into the wilderness and accepting this and so forth, is just, it raises the specter of just how long is it going to be. I'm someone who sees myself being on the political right for most of my life, unless there are pretty dramatic changes in American politics. But I also see the political right as being kind of a mess in certain ways, a spent force in certain ways, in kind of the same way that the Democrats were between 1968 and the 1980s. But that was a long period of time while the Democrats were sort of trying to find themselves and losing election after election and so forth. And one of my theories of what's going to happen in American politics is that the Republicans could be in for an awfully tough 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I have to say, I mean, in a lot of respects, I think it gets easy to overstate some of these Republican problems. Which, because there's always any movement, any party, has a variety of problems. But I mean, the crux of the matter is that George W. Bush rose to vast public popularity on his handling of Al-Qaeda and Islamist terrorism. And sort of the whole movement really reoriented itself, right, around this new idea, this new organizing principle for American politics, and then kind of, ran things into the gutter in Iraq. And it just strikes me that there's a certain level of dissonance within the conservative movement as to whether or not, how seriously they take sort of their own rhetoric about about the transcendental importance of all this, now that it's no longer a politically convenient cudgel?
Right. No, yeah, there's definitely there's definitely a disconnect there. I mean, I think a lot of people in the conservative movement take it very, very seriously.
Right. At the same time, right, like, John McCain, right, if anybody takes this seriously, I think, among conservative political figures, it seems like it is John McCain, who really has been identified with these issues. But, like, he goes for this stroll in Baghdad, and he's just telling, like, weird, petty, easily exposed lies about it. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
In a way that...
No,
in a way that makes it seem like he doesn't really care about the Iraq War?
Yeah, in a sense, although, I mean, this is the thing, and, maybe there was never a golden age of yore where, politics stopped at the water's edge and so on. It does seem to me like people in both parties over the last couple of years really don't seem to be taking the Iraq War that seriously. I mean, if you look at the Democrats, you have, on the one hand, the Democrats who insist, Iraq is a catastrophe and we need to get out now, and you have the Democrats who insist, no, we support the troops and it's a vital front on the war on terror, but Bush has mismanaged it and so on. But as with McCain, nobody seems to be willing to take massive political risks for any of these things that they supposedly believe in. I don't think that's specific to McCain.
No,
I think it's just
that's true. But I mean, the difference is that I don't think you see anyone on the Democratic side, even the sort of more hawkish kind of Democrats, claiming that, at least anymore, is still adhering to the view that there's like a titanic, all-important clash going on that we need to be engaged in. You don't hear this kind of, World War IV kind of rhetoric coming from...
Yeah, no, you're right. That has diminished even on the left. That's no longer something you hear from Democratic hawks.
Right. And I mean, and I think correctly that they after a few years of talking about that, people do ask themselves, like, well, okay, if it's really that important, do they want to trade anything off about it? And most Democrats, like most Republicans, want to get foreign policies that they think are good, but are not hugely eager to run dramatic political risks about them to majorly compromise, the sort of interests of their constituents over it, so on and so forth, which to me seems appropriate. I mean, I think the threat of Islamist terrorism, while real and much larger than the threat of, say, Russia conquering Canada, is just, not all that high, worth completely reshaping our society over. But it's a staple of conservative rhetoric to say that it is.
Right, so you're saying, so it's strange that McCain, who, as the voice of this, doesn't seem to be taking it. But yeah, I mean, all right, so he took a stroll in Baghdad, and I admit I didn't follow that closely what he said, but he took a stroll that was basically calculated to create an appearance of normalcy, which in fact obviously doesn't exist, right?
But he had said, I think before, that there are neighborhoods in Baghdad where you can just walk around safely these days, thanks to the success of the surge. And then he went for this stroll to the market and sort of asserted that like he was putting his money where his mouth was. But actually he was accompanied by 100 soldiers, Black Hawk helicopters, so on and so forth.
Right.
Which, like, I don't know. I mean, that was dumb. I don't know how he thought NBC News wasn't going to notice the helicopters flying overhead.
Right, it's politically dumb, but why is that per se a sign that he doesn't take the Iraq War seriously?
Well, just because the impulse to...
But look, what's the biggest... let's say you think, as McCain claims to, that the Iraq War is a central front in a global war that's the most important struggle of our time, right? What are the major barriers to success in Iraq? Well, okay, one of them is the incompetence of the Bush administration, which, McCain is running for president, in theory, to replace said administration. Another one is the fact that public support for the war has more or less vanished because we can't show any signs of progress. I mean, I think out of a mix of idealism and attempt at, playing politics, I can see a case for trying to persuade the American people that the surge is working, even if it isn't working as well as you say it is, just because you need to shore up domestic support for the war.
All right. I guess I'm going to have to.
When I talk to people who are real hawks, like both neoconservatives and the few remaining neoliberal true hawks,
sure.
What they talk about is the idea that we need to keep our troops there to avoid a civil war and hopefully get to a better outcome. The real obstacle to keeping our troops there is the fact that once Bush is gone, there's nobody who wants to keep the troops there. And so I think from their point of view, you can see the case for making what turn out to be kind of ridiculous gestures to try and increase U.S. public support for the war. Maybe.
Right. Okay. You know what? I can see that. It's a kind of it's the noble lie, sort of.
Well, right. No, we're back to that. Well, but it's not just a noble lie. It's like you can see somebody in the height of World War II.
Right. It's like old school, propaganda for the home front, right?
Yeah.
Cheer it on, boost morale.
Well, if we're on a war footing, why not have a little propaganda for the war front? Bill Maher was always saying we needed to raise war bonds and
I know. I guess that goes back to what I was saying, is that this is now a kind of spirit that's fallen away. I don't know where I was going with this. Oh, right. I guess just the point was that there's become a disconnect, I think, not just, about the sort of popularity of the policy, but about this kind of just notion of the significance of it all has sort of gone in one direction for kind of the hardcore base and another direction for most of the country, which I think overshadows all the sort of other questions about domestic policy and so forth that we were talking about. That to run in the primaries, you need to speak to this sort of alleged World War IV that's happening.
Right.
And most voters, I think, just don't think that that's what's occurring in the world.
Yeah, I wonder, clearly I think you should separate conservative intellectuals, who I do think are still largely invested in the World War IV mentality, or if not largely, a lot of them are.
Right.
From the conservative base, I think, and I don't have any polling numbers to back this up, I think they're more invested in the idea of, we need to win the war in Iraq because we're Americans and we win wars, and this is part of the war on terror, than they are in the sort of broader notion, the Podhoretzian World War IV mentality. And so it's possible, and I could be wrong about this, but it's,
So you think someone could pull away from some of those larger intellectual commitments while still sort of staying on okay ground with base voters?
It's possible. That would be my guess. You can see Rudy Giuliani kind of attempting to do this, actually, because he's somebody who, he's someone who's deeply associated with the war on terror, not so much associated with the war in Iraq.
Right.
And you can see him sort of trying to talk in new ways about the war on terror, like instead of saying I think he's criticized the term war on terror and saying, it's not our war on them, it's their war on us, and so on. And these are sort of, because he has a certain kind of credibility about terrorism, because, he was mayor of New York, so everybody thinks he's against terrorism.
Right.
He feels the freedom to maybe move in some of these directions that the GOP will have to move in.
Of course, in this weird way, I think Giuliani would actually benefit if it became acceptable to say that the law enforcement, quote-unquote, approach to terrorism is correct.
Right, no, of the
because
war,
the argument that Rudy Giuliani is a foreign policy expert doesn't actually make any sense. Whereas you can, the thing you would say, he has real credibility on, in fact, is, law enforcement.
Right. Right. Well, and in a broader sense, you could say, well, he's the guy who saved New York. Maybe he's the only guy who can save the Iraq War. But it's true that, if what you're talking about is dealing diplomatically with Tehran or Beijing, Rudy Giuliani doesn't seem like the guy with the most experience in that department.
No, right, right.
Okay. But to return just briefly to my theory of the GOP's decline.
Sure.
I think the real problem is that even once the GOP can move out from some of these intellectual commitments and out from, the immediate problem of the Iraq War, the danger for the party is just that its credibility on foreign policy is shot to heck, and that, regardless of whether it, disentangles itself from World War IV and so on, people are going to remember the Iraq War and associate it with the GOP for, 15 or 20 years to come.
Sure.
And that's where the GOP has some domestic policy problems. It used to have foreign policy as
its big advantage. Sure. No,
right. If you take foreign policy away, you get back in a way to the climate of the late 1990s, where the GOP was in some trouble. Except it's even worse because the GOP in the late 1990s, even though foreign policy wasn't a huge issue, it still had foreign policy credibility.
Right.
Now, foreign policy is a big issue. It's lost its credibility. Yeah. Anyway, that's the pessimist case.
Yeah. Well.
Or the optimist.
Okay, I have more to say about that, but I guess we're up at our express time limit.
That's right. Yes, we've done a half hour. Well, yeah. I hope our audience has appreciated this speeded up blogging heads, and thanks for chatting with me, Matt.
Sweet. All right. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.